Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of A Chat in the Square. Today, we are here with Ilayda Nijhar. She is a Russia and FSU political risk analyst, research fellow for theSquare, and also the founder of Unfiltered Voices. Today with Ilayda, we are going to speak about Russian geopolitics and foreign policy in its neighborhoods. Thank you, Ilayda, to be here with us. And I would like to start with a first question about the current relation between Russia and the West. And what do you think about how Russia is perceived in the West? Is it still considered a major threat? Something has changed? Please, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Jacopo, and theSquare for having me today. I think it'll be a very exciting discussion. There's always a lot to talk about with Russia and the FSU region. So just to kick off, is Russia perceived as a major threat? Well, I think we're seeing quite a lot of current political issues playing out, which would suggest so. For example, the current European energy crisis. Europe is relying on Russia for, I think, about 40% of its imported gas. Putin is being seen as exploiting the rising demands and low supplies for geopolitical purposes, which is obviously contributing to market volatility with prices surging across Europe. This is clearly being seen as sort of a political power play by Putin. And then you have the NS2 pipeline, Nord Stream 2 pipeline issue, which is obviously a Moscow-supported gas project led by Russian Gazprom. It has caused a lot of controversy, as many argue that it will strengthen Russia's presence in Europe and at the same time isolate Ukraine. Germany, of course, has been the most ardent supporter of this. However, having said that, earlier this week, they suspended certification of NS2 due to issues with approvals. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in context of the energy crisis as well. Looking again more recently with Ukraine, we're seeing a lot of noise and movement, particularly again in the context of the energy crisis. We've seen a lot of development with many anticipating that there will be major military incursion. So let's see. Having said that, though, there doesn't seem to be such a strong reaction from Washington or from the Biden administration. So perhaps this is because they are lacking a Russia or Ukraine policy. So I think perhaps this is a broader reflection of their view of Russia as a threat or lack thereof. We've also had direct issues between Russia and the US in terms of hacking. Numerous agencies, companies found that they have been compromised by Russian hackers. But I think sort of more broadly speaking, Russia is definitely not seen as sort of the biggest threat for the US, at least. I think it's all about China. China for Washington is a much bigger priority and is the key threat. So I definitely think the energy is focused there. Having said that, I mean, for Europe, it's not so much a big issue. I mean, broadly speaking, Europe enjoys good relations with China. It's not necessarily seen as a major threat. Russia is definitely a much bigger priority area for them. Having said that, I think Russia has taken advantage of the fact that the US is focused on China. Perhaps we're seeing that now played out in Ukraine. When you look at the recent trilateral security pact, for example, between the US, the UK, and Australia, the US-China confrontation is not really Russia's fight. And they've used that to their advantage, I would say, and it's helped to develop Russia's own strategy in the meantime. So yeah, I think Russia is there, that we're experiencing problems with it, but the West, and I'm broadly speaking as the West being here, the US, is much more fixated with China and doesn't, I would say, have such a strong Russia policy. Having said that, I would like to add just one final remark. I do believe, though, that there is a sort of, when looking at Russia and trying to understand Russia, a general misunderstanding towards it, and just in general, a lack of expertise in understanding what Russia is trying to do. We're particularly seeing that with the Biden administration now. I think this is sort of a broader reflection of foreign policies of the West. When we look at, for example, the current foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, he's been there since 2004, right? So he's a guy who's a very seasoned diplomat. He knows what he's talking about, and we're having consistently new people coming in, formulating policy, working on policy, and they just don't seem to understand, which is, reflecting in the sense that there is a lack of policy towards Russia, or decisions are made too early or too soon, which then sort of contributes to sort of a larger issue, which I definitely think, if is not worked upon soon, could contribute to Russia definitely being perceived as a much bigger threat than it already is.
Well, it's interesting because, yeah, I mean, we are both living in the Western world, and Russia, especially as you said about cyber threat, is perceived as the main threats, the Russian hackers, so on. But I definitely agree that in that sector, as in many other, China, I mean, can represent a bigger threats to the West, or at least for the US. Well, we spoke about the West, but I really would like to know your opinion about a closer region to Russia, which is the Black Sea. I mean, there was the Crimea annexion, and since then, Russia is becoming more active in the Black Sea for geographical reasons. The Crimea now it's a part of Russia. And the Black Sea, I mean, it's also a region of interest for Turkey and Turkey's foreign policy. Do you see the Black Sea, let's say, suitable place or stage for a future conflict or potential conflict between Ankara and Moscow?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good question, and a question on a lot of people's minds. So just taking it back a bit, so the Black Sea region is a domain that has traditionally been a place for a long geopolitical rivalry between Russia and Turkey, and it has tested and continues to challenge the Russo-Turkish relationship. For Russia, on the one hand, the Black Sea region is an integral part of its regional strategy, right? To project Russian power and continue to influence the Mediterranean. For Turkey, however, it also sees the Black Sea region as its own arena. However, in recent years, Russia has become the more dominant power. And I think Turkey has accepted that, as much as it didn't, want to, but it has, it's a fact. I would say Russia sort of views the Black Sea region as a buffer zone against the influence of NATO countries in the region. So you not only have Turkey, but you also have Romania and Bulgaria as well. So this would suggest perhaps why Russia has become more aggressive in the BSR, the Black Sea region recently, which goes hand in hand with, NATO's continued sort of expansion and movement in the area. The 2008 Georgian War and the 2014 Crimea episode obviously resulted in tensions increasing in the Black Sea region, particularly, I would say, for relations between Russia and Turkey. So I would say it's a region which definitely continues to be delicate for both sides, but as I said, Russia is more dominant now. However, when looking at sort of broader Russia-Turkish relations, bilateral relations continue to be complex as ever. Both Presidents Putin and President Erdogan have a somewhat complicated relationship. The relationship continues to go through periods of highs and lows. And I think the wider international community keeps a very close eye on developments, because a lot of the time it's very unpredictable. But I think it will be interesting to see how and if relations will develop between Washington and Ankara, as that will have an impact on Russo-Turkish relations moving forward, for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, now between US and Turkey, relations are a bit more, not living their best period. But yes, of course, being Turkey a NATO member, it might be a difference in the future if Turkey and the US are reapproaching in the future, of course. Said that, I want just to add that I mean, you cannot overcome geography, and I think in Black Sea, as historically speaking, always Russia and Turkey had clashes. Probably, maybe in the future, we have to keep an eye on that region. But I would like also, you mentioned China before, and we know that China is very active in Central Asia, which it was considered, the post-Soviet republic that were created in Central Asia were considered a Russian backyard. But with all this investment from China that are expanding, do you think Russian hegemony is under threat in Central Asia or even at its ends?
Yeah, I think that's quite a big question, but also one that can be quite sort of politically sensitive. I think that there is no doubt that there has been a trend sort of leaning towards anti-Russian, anti-Chinese influence across Central Asia in recent years. I think this is particularly noted with the younger generation who, have not necessarily been brought up in sort of that sort of post-Soviet mindset. However, the reality remains that for many of the political and business elites, Moscow and Beijing are still much more viable options when compared to, say, Washington, or London. I think that this is due to a number of reasons, namely sort of entrenched Russian business interests and networks across the region, as well as, China's inattention towards sort of human rights or good governance related issues. This very much sort of plays and feeds into the Central Asian sort of, forward, looking forward in terms of business and policy. But I think when looking at the Central Asia region, one has to understand that many of those with power and who sit within positions of influence are a product of the old Soviet system. So their thinking and mentality often draw a lot of similarities. So while it's true that China is pouring millions into the region and attempting to gain more influence, Russia still maintains that stronghold, and it's not likely at all to stop being active in the region anytime soon, I would say, because it has that already, strong, in terms of cultural influence and just sort of educational influence as well. There has been, at the same time, there has been a lot of anti-Chinese protests, particularly in Kyrgyzstan, in response to the construction, for example, of Chinese factories. And although the Chinese government does try to strife those who speak out against Chinese investment, Sinophobia still continues to grow. So all in all, I think Central Asian nations still prefer to work with Russia than China. The political history is the biggest factor in this, as well as the Russian language, which still plays a very important role, both in diplomacy and the business culture. In contrast, very few still speak, Chinese in the region, and this is not something that, China is very happy about, but there's not much it can do. So I think the real question here would be sort of how will Russia counter Chinese economic expansion to the region, as this is something that it just simply cannot rival with, and especially when considering the pressure of international sanctions, etc., which Russia is clearly, sorry, for those who don't know, Russia is currently under a lot of sanctions. So for the time being, the Central Asia region favors links with Russia over China, but this is certainly something that I think China is increasingly looking to change, and an issue which Russia remains frustrated over and will definitely test, I think, sort of bilateral relations between Russia and China moving forward, not just for the region, but sort of, more globally as well.
Well, it's interesting how still Russia can, maintaining a political culture, and of course with the sanction, nobody at the moment. competing economically with China.
No.
It's an utopia, of course. So yeah, I mean, how it's trying to limiting the damage, let's say, in Central Asia by political culture. It's pretty interesting, and I think we will see the development in the future years. And I would like to ask you a last question, since our center is focusing more on Mediterranean. Um, I would like to ask you if it's after the intervention of Russia in Syria in 2015 and being active also in Libya and penetrating the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern region. Do you think that that moment it's totally ended, or it's still Russia trying to develop or undertake a foreign policy to, let's say, new and not traditional neighboring region like the Mediterranean, or not?
Yeah. So I think firstly, the situation in Syria is very complicated, obviously involves many different actors, and I think it's fair to say has developed in ways that many did not anticipate or foresee. Russia still obviously plays an integral role, and I would say is definitely, not lost its influence or control over the issue. And, I think for better or for worse, the situation will continue definitely into next year. I would say, however, in recent years, in terms of foreign policy, Russia has put more of an emphasis on the post-Soviet space within its sort of, tradition in its backyard. I think, as you mentioned, this was most notably seen with Crimea in 2014. Since then, there have been numerous sort of incidents, not so much, I would say, the Mediterranean, but again, in the post-Soviet space, where we have seen Russia take a much more dominant role, particularly in terms of foreign policy. So, for example, the second Nagorno-Karabakh war last year, which involved two former Soviet countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan. Russia clearly exerted its influence during that conflict, and we can continue to see that today, even its authority a year on from the conflict. I mean, just this week we've seen tensions increase again. We've had conflict, the worst since the end of the war last year, and Russia again is the main player there. But as well, Russian influence we can see in Belarus, for example, with the political situation which started last year, or with the protests. Russia, it's persisting. Russia is the key player. But again, a lot has been happening in the region in the last few weeks. We're seeing with the sort of the border crisis with Poland, between Belarus and Poland, the migrants. Russia again, behind the scenes, is definitely an influence, and its foreign policy is definitely being sort of moved into that direction. So all in all, I think sort of Russia has been seen to have engaged more with its neighbors recently, but I think it's also fair to say that it continues to play an active role across other regions, obviously including the Middle East and Africa, with the latter being obviously more of a location for investment and influence for Russia. I would note as well that in December, so the 8th of December, will be the 30-year anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it will be interesting to see how Putin will use the current sort of geopolitical issues within its sort of neighborhood, especially when looking at Ukraine, as I mentioned at the beginning, how this will feed into sort of Russia's longer sort of strategy, foreign policy strategy, or sort of outlook for the region, 30 years on. Will he do something big? People are, speculating, as I said, a big sort of major military incursion. Perhaps it'll be somewhere
at that
else.
level of engagement.
Yeah, I think there, I don't think it'll just be sort of a long essay as he produced a few months ago. This is something big. 30 years is big. This is something that he, as a leader, has never been able to, I think, fully accept. The fall of the Soviet Union. It's something that's very close to his heart. And it's very much what Russian foreign policy is grounded on as well. And we're seeing that through very different dimensions, both soft power, hard power. So you know, it's a good time that we had this interview. I guess there's a lot going on, but perhaps we can do a follow-up in 6 months and see, you know, what maybe some of the issues that we discussed today, if they played out, or, you know, how they've developed. But I think for now, that's sort of where I think I will end with that question. There's a lot more to be said, obviously, but I know we're short on time. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ilayda, because you gave a quite extensive, I mean, in the time we have for the chat in the square, you get a very extensive overview about Russia geopolitics and foreign policy, which, as you explained to us, it's more looking at its backyard and not to new regional adventures, let's say. Well, the Mediterranean and Middle East are quite a very fast changing place, but yeah, we will make a follow up in in 6 months and see how the things are changing from today. Thank you again, and see you soon. So for a
Thank you so much.
follow up.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.